You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I'm Sherry Lip, Marketing Manager here at Stimulus Technologies, and I'm here today, as usual, with Stimulus Technology CEO Nathan Whitaker. And today we're going to be talking about all the many communication devices that we use to communicate at work, and what kind of concerns and vulnerabilities we have with those. Hello, Nathan.
Hi, Sherry. It's good to be here as always.
So let's start out by talking about what kinds of communication tools are we talking about, and what are some of the concerns we have with them?
So when we're talking about, there's a lot of different communication tools, and I think today we're going to be talking about more text-based communication tools, like instant messaging, things like that. So obviously there's, email that's very common today. But I think one of the things that business owners need to consider is your employees maybe using tools to communicate among each other that you don't necessarily know about, because a lot of these tools are free to sign up, or they're maybe on their devices already, and your employees may be using them without your knowledge. Just a quick experience, a few years ago, a few members of my team wanted to have some instant messaging capabilities, and Slack was a new tool back then. And without talking to their supervisors or talking to me, they set up some Slack groups among themselves and were communicating among themselves without my knowledge or even a blessing on it. And the reason this was allowed is because it was all web-based, so there wasn't any software to install, and anything that we could do really other than blocking Slack as a website from them using it. So we eventually talked about it and put a plan in place, and made it so that we had an instant messaging platform across the company. But more than likely your employees are probably communicating with each other in ways that you don't know about, and that's probably our biggest concern.
Yeah, and I know with some of these, and we'll probably get into a little bit more about tips, but I mean, I know I've had that same experience. And, I use Slack for the marketing communication, but there are tools you can put in place because I can't upload files. So, I can't upload files, or nobody could log into my computer and upload a bunch of sensitive data into Slack. So there are some safeguards we can put in place even in these web-based tools.
Yeah, there's definitely things that you have to do or should be doing if you're allowing or using web-based tools to protect confidential data that's inside the company. As we know, uh, once it's uploaded onto the internet, it's probably there forever, and it's hackable forever. So the concern is if employees are uploading or able to upload into channels that you don't necessarily want them to, that information, especially if it's confidential information, could live on forever. And there's a ton of different communications. They come up all the time, whether it was Slack from maybe 10 years ago, or Discord that's kind of coming into business today, or as much as like Facebook or LinkedIn, or heck, that Strava, which is a tool for runners and cyclists to communicate with each other. There's instant messaging on that now too, and so your employees could be communicating through these different platforms, and potentially confidentially sharing information that you don't want to. So a quick story. A friend of mine runs a technology company, and he had issues with some employees that were going to be leaving the company, and they were communicating through text messaging with each other, and their whole intention was to steal employees or steal clients and leave. and they were using, off um, tools, that weren't company tools to upload, client records, client information. Interestingly enough, all that information is subpoenable in court later down the road, and so it was later discovered of all this communication that was happening. But that's the concern for you as an employee is or employer, business owner, is what information are you allowing your employees to share through non-regular communication channels. And that's, that could be a lot of different things. And so having that protection in place on your web browsers and in your file environment to protect against that is really important.
And I've heard a lot. You mentioned Discord, and that's kind of a social media forum site that you could have. It's kind of like a Reddit almost, and but businesses are using it for internal communication. Um, how is that become a part of just company policy? How that's used? I mean, are there very many safeguards a business can put in place for something like that?
Well, certainly you could block it. I mean, through technology, we could take and block the apps and websites. So if you do have specific concerns about different applications, you would just disable that through, security services on the endpoints and devices. Um, so that would be, a way to do that is say, okay, these are the platforms, and this would be my recommendation is to tell your employees through acceptable use policies and say, okay, on company devices with company information, we're going to only use Microsoft Teams, or we're going to only use Slack, and it's going to be our company Teams or company Slack service, and that's all that's allowed. We're not going to allow Discord or Reddit. I mean, heck, people are posting stuff to Reddit that they probably shouldn't, and it'd be good to monitor, some of these things. Um, but it's certainly important from to set an expectation across your company of what's acceptable, define what tools you're going to use as a company, and don't allow your employees to go beyond that. The reason employees, set up these, we call it shadow IT, which means that they're going to do their own IT work without letting you or the IT provider know, is because they're just trying to do their job the most efficient way possible. So, our team members, from 5 years ago, set up a Slack channel because they found that that was the easiest way for them to get their job done. And we realized, hey, that is actually a good tool. We need to do something in our organization to allow for this instant communication. And we went with, a different product, but, you know, just discuss it with your employees and say, why are you using Discord? Why are you using Slack? And, analyze that and say, okay, well, we need to have something in place for our team members to better communicate with each other. Let's make a policy and then enforce that policy through technology.
And I think another thing to keep in mind too is like how these things all integrate, because a lot of times Slack and Teams, you can start integrating all these apps with each other, and so you might be integrating it into a work system that you're not realizing. A lot of people, of course, are doing it for convenience, like you said, and not because they're trying to do anything wrong. But a quick story on my part, I worked at a place where we did customer service via Twitter. And so, and a lot of companies have, they have a dedicated customer service Twitter account, but since it was connected to our main one, somebody hacked into it and started posting on our behalf. And it wasn't even something that anybody was thinking about because, the Twitter one just went into a ticketing system and they're like, oh, that's fine. But actually somebody was able to get into the normal account and start posting things that we wouldn't want posted. So I think that's
Yeah, that
important to keep in mind.
that's a huge concern now. There's so much single sign-on and API integration across platforms, which makes it work better. But in the security industry right now, we're really concerned about platform integration, like you mentioned. So a great example, Sherry, that if you authorize what are called API integrations or API keys between two platforms, that means that you're basically saying, okay, these two systems can communicate with this data, but and they trust each other. The problem with that is if one of the systems gets compromised, you have a conduit into the other system. And this is happening a lot with single sign-on now, that you sign up for a new service, and it says, okay, you can create a username and password, or use your Google account, or use your Microsoft account, or use your Facebook account to log in. And it's just a convenient thing to say, oh, just use my Google account or Microsoft account, and then you enter, then you're always logged in through that service. But now that has a token, and it eliminates multi-factor authentication between the two platforms. So to get into that secondary platform, or to get back to the one that you're using a single sign-on, there's a token authentication that allows those two systems to communicate without you having to be involved or enter a password or multi-factor authentication again. And that's a way that hackers are now getting into these systems back and forth. So I know we've got a little off topic on communication here, but it is a concern that we have right now about this tokenization and multi-factor, or the single sign-on, that's bypassing the multi-factor authentication that we often set up. So these platforms that you're using, just be really careful about what you're signing up for. And it's better to leave them a little siloed, rather than integrating them, especially if they're unknown platforms. But even well-known platforms have been hacked. LinkedIn, I beat up on them on this podcast a lot, but they were compromised. It's been 8 to 10 years now. But even these big systems that are owned by big companies get compromised, and data gets leaked out, and if they have access in between your systems, then that's a conduit for a hacker to use one set of credentials to get access into other systems.
And with all these methods, communication, since it has become, texting, instant messaging, direct messaging, the Slack type programs, is that a bigger risk for not knowing who you're talking to sometimes?
Certainly is. I mean, I think text messaging is a really easy scenario. So I think we've shared the story on this podcast a number of times, that often, a new employee that joins Stimulus will change, and I'm grateful that they do this. They change their status on LinkedIn that said they're working for Stimulus Technologies now, and they're super excited to join the team. Their profile is visible, because LinkedIn was hacked in the past. The hacker may have that user's cell phone number, because that's in the private information that was put into LinkedIn. And so as soon as they change that status, within a few minutes, they'll get a text message from me and say, hey, I'm on vacation right now, and I really need to get these Amazon gift cards out to a few clients. Would you mind running down and picking these up? And they don't know my cell phone number, but they're getting this text message that looks potentially legitimate. And it's a scary thing out there. So it's text messaging is definitely an issue. So I always recommend, if to have a clear channel of communication with the team that you use, and that is valid, and authenticate any other communication against that. And if, as with any hacking, if it feels weird, if it doesn't feel right, or if there's pressure to do something right then and there, slow down, do, secondary verification that that's really what needs to happen, and use that. So it's a scary thing out there, especially with texting and instant messaging, and with all these other communication methods that are out there. Have one central communication method that you trust and is valid, and use that in general.
And so you mentioned, data retention earlier, and when an employee leaves, or even, maybe they're still an employee, but you need to see what they're doing, because it's kind of almost like, lines start to become, is it personal or is it work, with these types of communication. How do you ensure that you get, the data that belongs to the company? And, is there any possibility of privacy lines being crossed?
Again, it goes back to this acceptable use policy, and it should be clearly defined in your employee handbook and in your acceptable use policy that any communication that is performed on company devices is owned by the company. And the employees should take that literally. Is, if I send an email or I open up a web browser and I go to, a site and put information in, what I did during that time is owned by the company and could be, um, monitored, subpoenaed in the future, in a legal case. I mean, we've seen it over the years that, stuff gets out that, you know, it's being tracked somewhere. And, if somebody wants access to that, whether it's, by subpoena through a court case or, hackers trying to get access to it, it can be found. So my recommendation to all employees out there is, assume whatever you're doing on a corporate device is being monitored and recorded, and ensure that, that you would want your employer to see what you're doing. So, a funny case a few years ago, we often set up these monitoring systems. Just, it's more for protection and also logging purposes if there's a future HR issue. Employers aren't in the business of micromanaging every website you go to. But, if there is an issue or concern, especially if there's productivity issues and things like that, they might want to look at it, right? And if there's an HR problem, they might want to look at it too. So two cases that I just will share. We implemented this, and the owner of the company is like, "Hey, I'd like to see what the reports are looking like." And we bring up the report, and they're like, "This employee isn't the most productive employee. Let's see what he's doing." And sure enough, like the entire day, either on social media sites or they were on job search sites on their work computer. They were literally putting in applications for other employment. And that's certainly grounds for terminating that employee, that they were not, using their time productively and not working for the company. So certainly a big concern. The other thing that happened at another business is there was a sexual harassment case, and we had monitoring, and we go to the person's computer, and they were spending a lot of time, on pornography websites. And so, it's a terrible thing. They were doing it on work time. And so, just for all employees out there, don't use work computers to do that kind of stuff. Go, if whatever you want to do, if you're searching for another job, go home, do it on your home PC or laptop or tablet or phone or whatever it is. Don't do it on work devices, because just assume that it's all monitored, and somebody will find out what's going on.
Yes, definitely a good point. And so kind of getting into some of these tools, you can't, they're on our work devices, but there are apps that will go along with it that we put on our phones, like Teams or even a CRM app, just so we can be connected, or if we're moving around, especially when we're remote. Are there more vulnerabilities when you're putting those apps on a phone, on your personal phone especially?
Yeah, I think for the most part, like your mainstream communication software like Microsoft Teams, um, or Slack or something like that, is probably very safe to allow employees to put on their devices. One of the things Microsoft particularly does, and this is why we like Microsoft, is it has a remote wipe capabilities. And this is, from an employer standpoint, you'd want to look at is, if an employee leaves, can I remove that information from their device? And even if it's a company owned device, they may or may not return it. So is there a way to clear that data off from that device? And so Microsoft makes it so that we can. When the employee puts that app on the device, they give us authorization as an IT department to wipe that software off. So, if a salesperson leaves the company and they have OneDrive and Teams and all these apps on their device, and they leave the company, we just deauthorize that mobile device, and it removes all that data off the device. The question is an app like maybe a CRM app, can you do the same thing? Can you wipe the contents of that app off if that employee leaves, or can they still log in for a period of time and download customer information, maybe for their new employer that they're going to, a competitor or something like that? So those are questions as an employer you want to ask if you have the capability of removing that data off of the employees. Bring your own device, computer or laptop or tablet or whatever it may be, your phone.
Yeah, so it sounds like kind of this boils down to, besides the security measures we talk about putting on, is that an acceptable use policy is very important, especially now than ever.
Yes, yeah. Customers often come to us and say, "Well, I want to be able to do X, and I want to be able to prevent my employees from, going out to job hunting websites." And the first thing that I recommend them to do is say, have you defined a policy to say what they're allowed to do on their computers and or their devices or whatever it may be? And if they haven't, we need to start there. We need to start with defining the policies and then implementing those policies through technology. But first, the team members, the employees need to sign off on the rules of engagement with the company first, and then we can implement the technology to make that work. If the employer's like just changing things all the time, then your staff won't know what's right or what's wrong. So it's really important just to have that clearly defined. Whether bring your own device is allowed or not. Do you want to allow company information on an employee's home computer or personal cell phone or not? Just make those decisions as a company. And that we can help you as a stimulus. We can help you with that, and your IT people can help you with that too. And if there's any questions on that, we can walk through developing these acceptable use policies and security policies with you. And I talk about it in my book and in the workshops and keynotes that we do as a company. That that's one of the things we talk about is defining these policies properly and then implementing them through technology.
Yes, definitely. In our past podcasts, we talk about all the different layers of security. So, and then thanks so much, Nathan, for this information. I think this is a really interesting topic for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's definitely a different thing to think about, and there's a lot of aspects to communication, and this aspect of how you communicate with each other is important to think about as business owners to clearly understand how your team can be productive, but also limit the potential problems for your organization as you go through this.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks everybody.
Thank you for being here.